Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take that deep dive into the most important economic issues facing agriculture. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson. David Widmar and Brent Gloy are back with us from Agricultural Economic Insights, along with our Financial Services Officer, Doug Dickinson from South Central Iowa. And in today's episode, we're going to focus on the financial side of bringing the next generation back to the operation. And while we realize 30 minutes isn't very long to really dig in, we have focused on 3 questions to ask yourself when evaluating a succession strategy. So don't hesitate to use those Q&A bubbles at the bottom of your Zoom window to get your questions submitted to our experts. Brent, let's go ahead and get this thing kicked off.
Thank you, Carly. Great to be back this month and talk about what I think is one of the more common questions that we get over time, which is, how do we go about getting the next generation in operation? And today, that's a really big topic. But today, we really want to talk about the financial piece of that. But I think it's one of these things that it's kind of like this image here. You've got kind of the cookie cutter set of houses, every house kind of the same, in a development. They're laid out. Maybe there's a slight difference on a couple of the houses in the subdivision, but for the most part, they're kind of the same house over and over again, repeated. And when we think about estate planning or in succession planning, it's one of those things that you want to say, well, everybody's got that problem, and they all have some elements of it. Can't we just apply that common approach to it? But we really think it's more like that custom house, that every one of these situations is just a little bit different. And it's really hard to come up with that kind of cookie cutter approach that's going to meet each individual family's needs. And we just want to say, when you think about succession planning, it involves a lot. Estate tax issues, there's inheritance issues, what's fair versus equal, who gets what's the management structure look like, how do we delegate decision making, how do we bring that younger generation in, have them start making their own decisions, let alone things like legal structure. And you can just go on and on and on about all the different things you have to do. But really today, what we want to look at is the financing piece of it. And so one of the real questions we have to ask in doing that is, do we have the appropriate scale to do that today, or do we need to work towards increasing that over time? So when we think about financing the next generation, there are kind of 3 buckets of questions that I think need to be asked. And the first one is kind of, what's your capacity, or what's the operations capacity? And there, that's a pretty broad category. But in this webinar, we're talking about financial, but you have to think about management capacity, time, etc. But really, we're talking about what's your capacity to generate earnings to bring that next generation in. And then we also have to think about family needs. And on the capacity, back to capacity, I mean, we can modify that obviously by keeping off-farm jobs or taking off-farm jobs, or there's a variety of ways to modify that capacity. And the same with family needs. What is it that the family needs to get financially out of this operation? Because that's really going to impact our ability to finance the farm. So we want to really think about family needs and be realistic, because I think this is a huge source of tension. And if you think about it, one of the problems is typically the older generation might own most of the business. The younger generation has this much smaller piece, but might actually have higher family living needs. And so figuring out how to structure that to meet those differing kinds of needs is really important. And then we also want to think about what are the opportunities for growth that this operation has, that can, growth can solve some of those problems if done right, of increasing the capacity of the business.
So, Brent, we're going to spend just a few minutes going through each of these and breaking down and providing you with a little more insights so you can take these to your operation and you can start to answer these questions. And again, we outline this in 3 questions and really encouraging you to spend some time on these. These are the types of questions that are going to generate more questions. And that's a good thing. That can be frustrating when you're in the moment, but it's a really good thing because it's going to help you be prepared and kind of do the digging to get to the answers that your operation is looking for, that you're looking for. So the first piece here is, what is your farm's capacity? And one of the things that we hope that we've shared over several webinars at this point is there's a limited earning potential that any given acre or any given head of livestock can generate. And that's going to be pretty consistent across operations in your area. So 2 neighbors are probably going to have a very similar earning potential. And what does that look like? Well, here's what it looks like from your budgets or from your income statement is we have top line revenue, less variable expenses being seed or fertilizer, crop protection. And the difference there is that contribution margin. And contribution margin is how much earnings we have to cover our fixed and overhead obligations. And that's what we mean by that limited earning potential. And so we need to think about what that looks like for your operation. And now what really separates you from your neighbors or from other farms in your area is this second category here, those fixed and overhead obligations. These are critical. And these are going to really, set the tempo or the pace for how your operation allocates those contribution margins and how much is there for you to maybe bring on that next generation. As you're going to notice, there are several previous webinars that we've done that have covered some of these topics, such as cash rent, machinery expense, how much debt can we finance, family living. So I encourage you to go watch those previous episodes. But the way this topic fits in today is that we only have so many of those contribution margins per acre. And if we have one of these categories that's really, really big, it could limit our potential to generate enough earnings to bring back that next generation. So start by understanding this contribution margin and this fixed and overhead obligation portion of your operation. The second piece I want to add to this is think about this in a short-term, but also a long-term consideration. Maybe, where are we at today? Where are we going to be out in 5 years? What might this look like in 10 years? Because what can happen is fixed expenses can be very painful, very difficult, not easy to estimate, such as machinery expense. But once we get a good estimate of that, it starts to become a little more forecastable or a little more plannable. In fact, more so than maybe fertilizer. We have no idea what fertilizer prices might be, but we can probably be in the ballpark where our family living expense might be. It might go up a little bit, but we can have some forecastability or some predictability in the future. So really start thinking about the long-term considerations. Why is this important? Well, if, for example, you know that you're about to get a piece of land paid off, that could really free up some of those overhead obligations that you have. Or maybe you know that you're preparing to buy a neighbor's farmland. And so maybe actually we're going to need more resources in the future to go to financing this farm that we want to purchase in the coming year. So really think about that in a short-term and a long-term consideration. The second piece here that we want to spend a little bit of time thinking about are what are your family needs? And again, there's a webinar about this that we did a while back ago. Encourage you to check that out. But also, identify where you are today, what are the current family living withdrawals, but then also thinking about what might the additional family living withdrawals can be. And there's this balance between how many resources, how much income does the household need? And there's 2 sources there, on-farm and off-farm living. And so those can offset each other or they can complement each other there. So really think about this new family member, this additional family member, what's that going to look like? And then get down to this question about, well, there might be an offset. Could there be somebody in the operation who's, retiring and there's a retirement account set up, and so they're literally not going to be taking resources out of the farm in the future. Maybe there's a hired position that this new family member can slide into and take some of those responsibilities but offset that expense. Maybe there's some custom hired activities that you're currently hiring somebody to do for you. Maybe there's an offset there that you're going to do them yourself. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you're going to start doing some custom hiring activities to help offset that additional family living withdrawal. But I want to point out here is that we tend to get really optimistic about what the offsets might be. And so we might overstate what those offsets are, and we might understate what that additional family living withdrawal might be. And so this is kind of one of those things where we get to this question and it's really easy for us to say, oh yeah, we'll make this up with, this retirement thing that's going to happen and this higher labor position that we're not going to refill. But spend a few more minutes, put these down, quantify these, put these down on paper, and really understand the magnitudes of what those look like. And again, I borrowed this from the last slide, short-term versus long-term consideration. There's some planability here with this category. What we want to do is we don't want to fool ourselves into future problems. And what do I mean by that? We talked about this in the family living webinar, but it's pretty easy to sort of have this bootstrap, tighten our belt. The next generation's coming back from the farm. They're 23 years old. They can use an old farm pickup. They're single. They can live at this old farmhouse that we have, no additional rent. They can get by on maybe $20,000 or $25,000 a year in additional cash flow coming from the farm. But how sustainable is that going to be for 5 or 10 years down the road? We want to make sure that we don't have a scenario where it worked for the family member to come back right away, but we didn't put plans in place that allowed the family withdrawal needs to grow as that additional family member grew. So once they get married, they start having kids, as Brent talked about, they might have a larger family living needs, the withdrawal needs, than what we initially saw from the current family members. So really want to think a lot about that. And one point here that I'm going to mention, I know Brent's going to talk a little bit more about this, is family living withdrawals don't always have to be negative. There can be positive. So maybe part of this conversation is financing the next generation is maybe there's going to be some off-farm activity that gets the off-farm living pretty small, or maybe even to the point where the next generation's adding some money to the operation to help finance and generate new opportunities for them to step in and to grow their role down the road. And the third question here, we think it's important for you to spend some time here. This is probably the most exciting. This is where a lot of folks want to spend their time, a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential, a lot of enthusiasm is often here, but what are the growth opportunities? And we wanted to point out kind of two broad categories. When we were preparing for this, Brent had some ideas here that there's one slide we could spend an entire hour talking about, but you can spend a whole lot of effort and time here, and we're not doing this full justice, but here are a couple ideas. One of them is scaling up. What does it look like for you to add 500 additional acres or 1,000 additional acres? And specifically, what are those additional fixed costs? If you're going to farm 5 acres, a 5-acre patch for the neighbor, that's probably not going to require you to buy a larger piece of equipment or hire an additional full-time employee. So the marginal fixed cost there, the marginal cost is going to be pretty limited. But chances are you can't take on 1,000 additional acres on your operation without having to adjust the scale of your current equipment or the scale of your current fixed obligations. And so we want to think a lot about, as we're bringing that next generation on, how scalable is this opportunity? At some point, we might hit some natural breaking points where it's going to be really hard for us to scale without making significant new investments. And so keeping that in mind. The second opportunity here is what we're calling branching out. So maybe there's a new farm enterprise, and this could be something where the next generation gets really excited. Maybe they're going to do some custom work for some neighbors. Maybe do some custom agronomy work, some applications. Maybe they want to have some sort of meat business out of the livestock side. These can be really exciting. We want to spend our time and do our due diligence. But the point that we want to really emphasize here is not all expansions or investments will immediately generate a new additional annual cash flows. And so what we really want to do here is kind of untangle some of this. Is this a good business venture for the operation? Yes or no? And then follow this up with it. Okay, what are the cash flow implications? And how does that fit into this question of financing the next generation? How do those cash flow obligations line up? So we want to be kind of careful on how we evaluate these, and we want to make sure we get the right answers lined up with the right questions that we're trying to work through.
David, I think we've kind of laid these out as capacity needs and growth opportunities, and I think it's really important that you kind of work through those in that order, because a lot of people really want to focus on this expansion, but one thing that we know is that expansion will create stress because it's going to use existing resources more intensively, and if there's any kind of stress in the operation already, it magnifies it. So it's really important, I think, before we hit this growth phase, to really get the first two questions nailed down. Those are great things to go talk with your FSO about, before you get to the expansion, because it's tempting to just jump right into it. And then when we think about that expansion, we really want to focus first on what we're doing and make sure we're doing it really well before we expand, because this is probably the greatest stress point in most operations. You add additional work, and probably additional financing, and that creates a lot of additional stress. And so it's really important, I think, to get things nailed down and buttoned up pretty well before just undertaking these new opportunities, which, yes, they are exciting and they're great, and we need to do them, but doing them right will pay big dividends. Doing them wrong can create huge problems.
One thing that's going to come up in these conversations naturally across these three questions, be watching for this, is the personal preferences around risk are going to be really important to identify and be looking out for. Real quick example is how much debt are you comfortable bringing on? The older generation might be looking to wind that down, or maybe get that to a very manageable lifespan. When you're in your 50s or 60s or 70s or even your 40s, signing a 30-year note starts to look a lot different than if you're 20 or 25. Sort of that plays out a little bit differently. So keep that in mind. And Brent, I want to give you a chance here to talk a little bit about this next point, the value of time.
Yeah, and I think particularly for the younger generation, this is one of the most important things to realize, is that you have one of the benefits that the older generation doesn't have, and people like me don't have. You have time, and time is your most valuable resource. You've got a long runway over your career, and little investments early on can make a big difference. And of course, we're talking about financial investments. Smart investments early on can really pay big dividends over a time period. But also think about investments in your expertise, and building your professional expertise over a long period of time is going to have a huge benefit. So I think sometimes people get in a little bit too big of a rush of trying to reap investments before building all that expertise and building those financial resources. And if you can just save a little bit early on, and I often tell the story of one of my neighbors when I lived in West Lafayette, was a doctor, and she was having some financial troubles, went through a divorce and all this other kind of stuff, and was just really down in the dumps because she was having a lot of financial troubles. And we looked at kind of her situation, and this is a person who's making a lot of money, a lot, shouldn't have been a problem, but she also had a lot of expenditures. And you just gotten out of medical school, so you want to increase your standard of living, and that's really tempting. But what I try to convince her, if you can delay that consumption for just maybe 4 or 5 more years, you're gonna have more money than you know what to do with. If you can just build and make those investments over time, in her case paying down some debt and not consuming quite so much, it would make a huge difference. So build a plan, think about not only finances but your the knowledge that you want to, what do you want to be an expert in? Maybe it's finance, maybe it's production, maybe it's, I don't know what it is for each individual person, but ask yourself, what do I want to be known as? What do I want to be an expert at? And start working toward that.
So Brent, a billion seconds is 31 years. And so a lot of times that incoming generation is a time billionaire. And so thinking about how they can use that time to work in their benefit could be a huge asset, especially as it plays out over the long run. So to wrap this section up a little bit, I wanted to sort of reemphasize, we laid out 3 questions. And the temptation when we have a list of 3 things is to sort of check the box and say, what was the answer? Did we get 3 yeses or 3 nos? And that's not the way these questions really framed up. These 3 questions are going to challenge you to do a little bit of work, and you're going to sort of learn a lot about yourself and your operation. And so these aren't just simply a yes and go. And so in a lot of cases, you're going to say, okay, maybe we need to tweak the plan a little bit. Maybe we need to reposition this a little bit. And then the next thing building off that is, don't let perfect be the enemy of great. You're not going to be able to have all the answers once you start to move forward with this plan. So once you put this plan together, there are going to be things about the future that you're just not going to be able to have full information about. And I'll give you an example going back to this custom built house. You might be thinking about, well, what's going to be the popular floor in 10 years or 15 years? Is this color of exterior going to be what we want in 7 or 8 years? And so what you want to do is you want to put in a plan that allows flexibility and that allows you to make progress today, but that also allows you to respond to what the next generation's preferences are, what the next generation's needs are, and allows you to continue to make progress. So we kind of got to work our way between getting started today, but also building a plan that allows for flexibility down the road. So with that, we're going to jump over to our Ask a Lender section. And it's been a lot of fun working with Doug to prepare for this. So Doug, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to kick this off by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, David. My name's Doug Dickinson, Financial Services Officer out of the Red Oak office in Southwest Iowa. I serve customers primarily in Adair, Union, Adams, Ringgold, and Taylor counties. Been with the company about 10 years. Spent the first 4 years as a crop insurance specialist, and then have been on the lending side since then. Prior to coming to Farm Credit, I spent about 12 years as a grain merchandiser for a couple different companies. As a hobby, I have a small farm that's part of my family's operation in Western Iowa, and then also have a small cow herd that I take care of, just to say I could call myself a farmer. But
well, great. We've enjoyed your insights and looking forward to you sharing a few today, and then also sticking around for the overtime Q&A that we're going to have after the 30-minute mark. So I'm sure listeners are typing in their questions now. One of the questions I wanted you to answer here, though, is what are some of the best practices that you've observed families who are wrestling with the question of, can we bring the next generation on board wrestling with? What are some best practices you've seen them use?
Well, I've got a couple examples of operations that I've worked with over the years. Both of them were situations where sons were coming back from college, or maybe they'd worked worked full time for a few years and then decided to come back to farm. Like Brent mentioned earlier, some of the things we looked at was, capacity. Is the operation big enough to bring them back? And just, kind of looking at that and making sure we can support, both families in that case. The first example was, the son worked for an ag technology company for a couple of years, and he came back, and the family operation had some row crop acres, had some finishing barns and that sort of thing. So there was plenty to do around the farm, but at the same time, is there enough revenue to cover, having son come back and, paying him a wage and that sort of thing. And, but it worked out in this example that there was a neighboring set of hog barns that came for sale and happened to be, using the same integrator as what they were using. So it worked out that they were able to purchase those hog barns, and it kind of helped utilize his labor. And, then since then they've added some manure handling equipment, and they're able to do their own manure instead of hiring somebody else to do it. And, they've also picked up some custom manure business as well. So it's kind of help generate some additional income and just help spread that out over their operation. The other example, had a couple sons. They went to college, came back, helping dad farm in the operation, and had a couple landlords pass away, and of course the family wanted to sell the farms, and the operation could have let the farms go, but seeing that the boys are wanting to farm, and dad's getting up there where he didn't really want to take on a lot more debt, so he was able to work with them and getting each boy to buy one of the farms, and worked out that each farm had a house on it, so they were able to move to the house, and that helped kind of get them out of the mom dad's house and get them started on their own as well. Both those situations, mom and dad provided good support for that younger generation. We had mortgages on some land already for them, and so we was able to use existing mortgages to kind of help secure the new debt and help grow the operation. So
what I really liked about those stories is on the surface they seem to be very, very different, but it goes back to this custom needs thing that we talked about at the outset of this. Is they both had to know what their operations were, where the starting point were. They had to know where their plans and their goals were, and so they had to build a custom solution that matched their opportunities and their needs, but also their interests. And so I really appreciate you sharing those. I want to talk a little bit about doing nothing. You enlightened me a little bit as we're preparing for this. I want you to speak a little bit. What if a producer does nothing in this space?
Well, I mean, there's some things, let's use that one example where the two sons bought the farms. I mean, if you do nothing in that case, I mean, the families are probably going to sell the farms to somebody else. And so the operation not only, doesn't get the farms bought for the boys, but they also lose the acres. And so then you're having to go out and try to find additional acres to replace those. And so there's a situation there where it can kind of be detrimental if you don't have enough acres really to start with. The other thing about doing nothing and talking things over with your younger generation is, let's say dad wants to farm till he's 70 or 75 and really doesn't, and we see this quite often, is where hasn't really got the boys started, and next thing you know, something happens to him, and they're 40, they've been a hired man for 20 years and they're 45, 50 years old, and all of a sudden you got siblings to contend with, and then next thing you know, they're just wanting the cash, and so his son in a position to be able to buy out the siblings, and it can be detrimental there as well. So
I think one of the things that you shared that really stuck with me is doing nothing is a decision with consequences and impacts, and those outcomes could be very undesirable. So we have to recognize that as we go through that. There's a lot of folks listening here today, and they might be curious about how they can start a conversation with their financial officer and how they might get the ball rolling on this topic. Do you have a suggestion as to what might be a good question that they can ask their trusted advisors here in the finance space, and how they can get some input in this process?
Well, first off, I want to say, I mean, we're here to help. We've got, a team of experts for our company that, if we don't have the answers, chances are somebody in our organization does. And so, I mean, in most cases, we've got pretty good relationships with our customers, and hopefully they're comfortable enough coming to us to ask, hey, we're looking at slowing down a little bit and wanting to bring Junior on to help out and get a little more involved with the operation. What are some things we can do, or, that sort of thing? Can we get him brought back on? We've got some new programs we're going to be starting here in the next few years with young and beginning operators, and getting them a little more educated and hoping to help get that next generation on a good start.
I think that's really good advice. Appreciate that. So here's my last question for you before we get to the overtime, and Carl's going to wrap us up after this. If you could put one piece of advice on a billboard for thousands of producers to see here in June of 2022, what would that advice be? And it can pertain to the topic today, or it can pertain to something much more broadly to farm and farm management.
I guess I would like to say, just always be open and honest with your lender. I mean, we're here to help you guys grow and succeed. We just need your help in order to do that. So, I mean, just staying open with your lenders is big.
Well, Doug, thank you so much for that. Appreciate your time, and appreciate you agreeing to stick around for overtime.
We'll start with a question about how are rising interest rates going to impact the next generation? And it's a good question. one of the things that's happening right now is that interest rates are going up pretty rapidly, especially short-term interest rates. It's actually pretty shocking, I think, when you just step back and look at how much they have changed in the last 6 months. So the reality is that as interest rates go up, it increases the cost of borrowing and the cost of debt service, and so it makes borrowing harder, more expensive, and so it can be a drag on your ability to add financing. So now the reality though is we don't know how high interest rates are going to go and how long they're going to stay there, and I think that's a real open question. So we do know that as they go up, though, it will be more challenging. I think we have to use some perspective, though, and step back and say that it's not necessarily 100% that they're going to the moon. So and they're never going to come back down again. But I think just things change. They were really low not too long ago. Someday they may come back down. We just don't know when. And David, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Brent, I might just add that, rates have gone up here in the last 6 months, but you look historically 30, 40 years, we're still very good rates. We're just used to the rates with the 3 in front of them the last several years, and it kind of gets everybody used to them. But, historically, we still got good rates compared to where they have been in the past.
Yeah, we're back to about 2018 levels right now, I would expect. But, I think the trend is certainly moving upward right now, and we may be in for much higher rates. So it's something to keep an eye on.
I'm going to jump in, Brent. I think, it's always important to reach out to your financial officer. Maybe there's some programs that can help you during this transition. So, we always want to be mindful of all the opportunities that can be afforded to us. I also think it speaks to being really honest about some of the assumptions we make when we're going through the 3 questions. What are our needs? What are our capacities? What are our different opportunities? And we're in a really profitable time in farming over the last few years. We're not going to see profitability at these levels continue for the rest of our careers, right? We're going to revert to some mean. We'll have some stabilization, but we're in an era with really low interest rates and fairly decent profitability, at least at the sector level. So we need to think about that. And we want to make sure that we build in good assumptions for what the next 5, 10, 15 years might look like.
Yeah, and that's really hard in a rapidly changing environment. But I think it's really important to be realistic, and we know that this probably isn't going to last for forever. So I got a couple questions. One about how do we keep off-farm kids happy? And that's a pretty loaded question, but a legitimate one, and one that I think a lot of people have to deal with. And I would say one of the first steps in all of this is communication. It's really important to communicate about why you're doing the things you're doing. And so I think trouble comes when things haven't been communicated, and everybody just listens to mom or dad and they just do what it is because that's what they said it was going to be, but hadn't really thought through why mom and dad came to the decisions that they came to. And so when they're gone, then it can be a real challenge. So I think communicating is really important, and in that whole process, because what might not seem fair to the off-farm children might also not seem fair to the on-farm children as well, and so it can be really tough. But I think communication is a key in all of that. Another question about along those same lines, how do we how do we do this with a larger family owned, a large family owned entity with multiple kids? And again, I think maybe they're all in the same operation, and figuring out a space for each one of them is really important. And so figuring out a niche and set of responsibilities is really important to keep people happy, and communicating why that's being done is really, really important.
Brent, I think another thing to mention here is it's going to be pretty much impossible to put together a plan that everyone agrees is completely fair. I think we always want to be careful with trying to get, this perfect agreement. What we want to do is we want to get buy-in, and we want everyone to agree that, I might not be getting the perfect deal, but it's contributing and I'm better off than, the sum of the, what was that saying, Brent? The sum of the parts are more than the whole, or the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And so we want to make sure that everyone feels like they're contributing to the operation, but they're also being compensated for those, what they're contributing, and just, again, communicating and sharing the reasoning and some of the math behind why they're laying it out the way it is. I think that's really, really key. Err on the side of over communicating, and then being willing to revisit if a few years down the road that plan doesn't make as much sense as it did, when you set out with it. So thinking about how we might be able to update the plan as new things come along.
Yeah, I have a good question with a lot of detail about a family that is trying to go through this process. And they have 3 kids, and one currently involved, but also has an outside job. Another one that wants to be involved, paying a wage. And then how do you split that up? And I think, and then even an off-farm son that they want to treat fairly. And I think that's reality, is that everybody wants to treat everybody fairly, and it's hard. And I think you have to sit down and think about what's each contributing to the operation. When you go to splitting shares, and think about what's each contributing, what's, what should be expected in that respect. And then, as if something were to happen and you're no longer there, then there's a piece of, well, who gets what, how do you split it then? But you probably want it to be able to continue. So it's a complicated situation. I just encourage you to talk with as many people, get some specific ideas from as many people as you can. And I think your FSO is a great place to start. They're going to have some ideas, and they're going to be able to sit down and help you walk through things kind of logically, because sometimes it gets to be emotional and challenging, and everybody has a common goal they want to do, but trying to kind of step through the logic of all of it is really, really important.
And one thing that came to my mind as you're sharing that, Brent, is, there are some variables there. There's some math there that we can lay down. We can create a budget, or we can show, all the different streams of income or revenue. And so we want to get the math kind of there. We want to get it down, and then, start to move forward from that. We want to, get as much data collection as possible, and then start to tackle some of those more difficult emotional questions.
Sometimes if you just lay the numbers out, and it kind of helps answer the questions for them a little bit, knowing that they may have to have some sort of off-farm income to help supplement the operation as well, or just laying all that out helps a lot, I think. Or otherwise you're just kind of thinking in general and you don't really know for sure. But
right, laying it out and coming up with a plan to accomplish your goals, because I think sometimes we stop at, well, let's lay it out and say, oh, it's not possible, which is another one of our questions. Is, well, what if there aren't any parents to support the younger farmers? Is it even possible to get started? And what I would say is, yes, it is. I can think of numerous people I know, and a couple of them just fabulously successful, that didn't start with parents in the industry. They might have started as a nutritionist or something like that, and have become very, very successful over time. But what is true about this situation is that the conventional path is not there. So the conventional path of, I come back and use dad's machinery for a while, and he helps really, mom and dad really help you kind of get rolling. That's not there. So it's going to look different. The path is going to look different. And I'm not going to say that path isn't full of lots of stones and potholes and could be really, really hard. But it's certainly possible. But it's going to take a unique path to find it. What are some of the things Farm Credit is doing to finance the next generation? That's certainly beyond me and David.
I can answer that a little bit there, Brent. Obviously, we want to educate the young, producer that's coming back, and the Ag Start program can help them set up their own cash flows and that sort of thing. And we want to help step them through that and help them come up with the numbers and figure out. We want them to be able to make decisions based off those numbers. And we've also got a young and beginning program that we'll be starting here, and we're actually hiring some young and beginning officers, and we'll probably be coming out to our customers that have young producers coming back, and maybe looking for candidates that might fit this program and help them to get educated. Because let's face it, I mean, our farmers are getting older, and we need these younger guys to keep everything going there. So the more we can educate them up front, I think the better the operation is going to be. And there's also some beginning farmer programs with FSA that we work with as well, as far as buying land. And I mean, they've got some low down payment programs that we can kind of work with to help finance a farm and that sort of thing. So,
if there's anything I can add to the end of this conversation, is just we have a lot of resources here in the associations, and I would just encourage our producers to reach out to your lending officer and just ask, start having those conversations, because we do have a lot we can offer here. So that'll do it today for another episode of Two Economists and the Lenders. So thank you to Brent, David, and Doug for leading the conversation today. And for you in the audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online again next month.